one word. And if you go to that site, you'll see a link for resources, and everything is at that link. There's an annotated bibliography. All the books I've mentioned are in the annotated bibliography. There's a section for essays that has them by years, so it's really kind of fascinating to look at the years, because in 2009 there's one essay, and in 2010 there's a few more, and then in 2011 there's even more, and by this year there's already more than all the other ones combined, I think. So you can see the momentum building around this. It's in the community that writes essays, including journal articles and things like that. This is a handout. This is a thing you can just download online and print from 2010, which is from the U.S. government. That's a spiritual care handbook on PTSD/TBI, traumatic brain injury. I think it's actually relevant to moral injury, but the term was so new then they didn't use it. And it's got some pretty, it's about how you help support recovery and all the various dimensions of it, and it's pretty good. So it's, and it's free. You just print, the government documents are free. You just print this thing. But there's a bunch of other resources at our website. There's also a section on news stories and blogs, and we try to update it weekly. We don't always get around to it, but it's certainly updated at least monthly for anything new that's come through since we last updated it. So we try to, it's sort of like we're hoping to be a go-to site for if you're interested in moral injury. And there's a section, one of the things that I've done in my practice in teaching about moral injury, and I've taught 2 intensive courses, one at Pacific School of Religion and one at Fort Worth, and I'm teaching another one at Bright in January, is we ask the students to actually create assignments that might be useful. So they can, do a sermon series, they can write newsletter articles for their church or something like that. And in one class, a group of students, one who was a veteran, and I think 2 were veterans actually, and one was had been in AA a very long time, decided to use the recovery model of AA to create moral injury meetings. So they created a little booklet on how to do a moral injury meeting. That's at our website. And they tried it over across the street at TCU and found it really interesting to see how much vets wanted to talk about moral injury if you just give them a confidential place to do it. So that little booklet, if you use a recovery model for anything and know anything about it, it's actually designed to use that same model, which is useful in the sense that a lot of veterans are in recovery movement groups, so they'll recognize it as a standard format. That's in there, and then there was a student I had at Pacific School of Religion who did a really interesting homework assignment of a ministry, a storytelling ministry with homeless vets, because she was already doing homeless ministry, and she noticed that a lot of the homeless vets were homeless, or were veterans. The homeless people were veterans, and she thought, well, I wonder what I can do to help them process moral injury. And she sort of knew that homeless people carry kind of talisman objects, like a picture, in one case a ratty old towel somebody had given him, but something that means so much to them they fight to the death to keep it. And so she just asked them what they had that was like that, and then asked what the story was behind the object. And she got a lot of really interesting ones. So her project is also up there, and they now have a website with a homeless stuff they do with homeless ministries, with veterans, that grew out of her class project. And the project was called, if you know Tim O'Brien's book from Vietnam, the project she did was called The Things They Carried. His book is The Things They Carried. And she was inspired by that book to do this project with homeless veterans. So there are things like that up there as well. We add them as we get them. Sometimes people send stuff to us. If it looks good, we put it up. And if you know a resource we don't have up there, we should tell me about it. Send me an email or something, with a link or a document or whatever. We use the term soul repair. I just say a little bit. Let's say a little bit about the terms moral injury and soul repair. Kent Drescher, it's on our website, but Kent Drescher did an article for Traumatology in which he polled VA clinicians and others about the term moral injury and what they thought of it. And there are sort of like pros and cons to all kinds of uses of terms. And they had tried spiritual injury, moral distress, spiritual distress, and as I said, the Marine Corps kind of likes inner distress. And they finally settled on moral injury for the reason that it suggests that it's a moral conscience issue, but doesn't imply you have to be religious. And that was important to the veterans. Lots of veterans come back deliberately not religious. So you can be an atheist, you can have no religious affiliation and have a moral conscience and have moral injury. In fact, I think the only person that can have moral injury is a sociopath. Right. So they settled on moral as the term for the first word, even though the Marine Corps thinks it implies that what they do is immoral. So they don't like the term for that reason. But really it's a reference to moral conscience, not to particular acts. And then the second word was chosen because it's neutral. It doesn't imply a disorder or a psychiatric problem, that it's really just like an injury, which has a sort of neutral quality to it. It means that you're not okay, but that you're not okay doesn't make you disordered. And that means a lot to vets who really hate the PTSD stigma. In fact, Jonathan Shea no longer uses PTSD. He will only talk about post-traumatic stress PTS. Because of that. So many vets hate that. And it is true, it creates this cultural atmosphere that vets are head cases. As my friend Zachman says, they're either heroes or head cases. And sometimes both, like the American Sniper movie. But in any case, injury was chosen to imply a neutral thing. It's just a normal response to something bad that happens. So we use the term repair. This is just a summary of what I said, pretty much. I'm going to say a couple of things. But we use the term soul repair. Let me go back to that slide. Because we believe that moral injury is not a psychiatric problem. It's a spiritual problem. It's a problem of that thing that has to do with empathy and conscience. And the way we connect to other human beings being broken in some serious way. So we use the term soul, and we use the term repair because, first of all, it doesn't have any of the romantic or religious connotations of the term healing. And it implies you can sort of fix something, but it's never going to be quite the same again. And I think that's a really important truth to hold to, that somebody who's experienced trauma will never be healed and whole in the way they were before. In fact, being able to stay alive and cope with life may be as much repair as is possible, but that's some kind of repair. And it depends on the amount of trauma and the experiences, but we do believe repair is possible and life can go on and a person can live a good and fulfilling life, but they will always carry what happened with them. Just like if you break a bone in your body and it knits back together, it's generally not quite as strong as the original limb was. It's like I fell skiing once and banged my hip up, and anytime it's cold and damp, my hip aches. And it functions fine, but it hurts. It's never going to be the hip I had before I fell on the ice skiing. Those are things that are behind our use of the term repair rather than healing. People have asked, why don't we call it healing? Well, I think repair is more realistic and it's more grounded in the realities of moral injury. So the thing with moral injury is that it can emerge years later, like our B-52 bomber pilot didn't have it for 40 years. And then Pearl just got slammed with it. Because you can compartmentalize. Your intellectual brain can do a lot to keep things from haunting you. I mean, and as you age, that part of your brain begins to weaken. And so many vets I know, especially as they were dying, had to confess something to their minister that they'd never told anybody. because they've been able to hold it and keep going. And so it can emerge a very long time later. It's an aspect of every war. It creates that sense of isolation. And the UN has declared that solitary confinement is a form of torture, and moral injury can be a kind of emotional torture. Because you can't talk about it, you're isolating yourself, you aren't known to people as who you are. It can result from lots of contexts. It's not just war that causes moral injury. A lot of child abuse, child sexual abuse and child violence against children carry it because they believe they caused what happened to them. They believe they are responsible for their own suffering. And this is one thing I've learned. I want to say this, I have learned from this work, because I used to do rape crisis work. And anytime a woman said something like, well, I shouldn't have gotten wrong, I shouldn't have gone with that guy, I should have trusted my instincts. Our response was always, you didn't cause this, it's not your fault. Because, of course, legally, that kind of thing is used against victims all the time. I have learned to stop doing that and to listen first. Because, and Kristen Leslie, who's an expert on military sexual trauma and acquaintance rape, and I've had this conversation about how often when somebody says that, like, I was bad so my dad beat me, or I shouldn't have gotten drunk that night, that it's not that they're trying to take all the responsibility from what happened to them, but they're trying to find some moment in an awful situation where they might have had some personal agency of their own. Not because they could have prevented it, not because they brought it upon themselves, but because they're thinking forward. They're thinking, how next time can I be better so my dad won't beat me? Or how next time can I not get in this situation? And that is an important, healthy response. I think that's why that sense of personal agency is the only way you recover. And I think that's why so many veterans, even in a situation where they could have done nothing else than what they did, still want to take responsibility. If you make somebody 100% a victim, it means they have no power. And that is the worst thing you can do to somebody, is to take away all their power. So those kind of musings, those kind of, well, I could have done X, Y, or Z, is really an important kind of musing, and I think it needs to be supported as the person moves forward and realizes, no, they didn't cause it to happen, but yes, there are things they can do to take care of themselves. So that's part of the recovery process. So moral injury can happen in a lot of different ways, including many professions where people work under extreme conditions or under life or death conditions. So you have the medical caregivers, you have law enforcement, people who work in social work and ministry where you're dealing with people's feelings and they're talking about killing themselves or awful things are happening. You are in conditions of extremity even if you are in no danger yourself, and trauma is contagious. Yeah.
So when someone is taking that agency, what is a response?
What Marie Fortune says is, I say, so what have you learned from this and what are you going to take forward? It's not about taking blame. We have a culture that really wants to have blame so you can punish somebody. And I think sometimes people try to punish themselves by doing that. So you have to suss out, why are they thinking this way? And walk them through how this is a learning experience. And how they can take what happened to them as a way that informs what they do in the future without controlling what they do in the future, because they can also become obsessed with certain things. So it's a long journey. It's not one moment or one time when this all gets resolved. But I think encouraging people's sense of personal agency realistically is really important to the recovery process. And that doesn't mean absolving people who do terrible things from taking responsibility for what happens to them. But I also, in Judy Herman's she was a fellow in my program at Harvard when I was running that fellows program. She was one of our scientists. And she and I had a long conversation about how her new project was Restorative Justice, which works on reestablishing healthy relationships in a community rather than punishing people. And the reason she had moved in that direction, she said, was because her experience in counseling sexual abuse survivors a lot was that most of them don't want the abuser to go to prison. They may even love the person who did terrible things to them. In fact, they often love that person. What they really want is an admission of truth that this really happened to them and an apology. That's really the most helpful thing a lot of victims of child abuse and sexual abuse want. And the justice system instead separates the abuser from the victim, prosecutes the abuser, and puts them away so they never have to see them again or anything. And what that does is it leaves it unresolved for the person who's experienced the violence. So she got very interested in restorative justice for that reason. And I think that that's actually, there's something about the person who's been wronged entering into a different relationship with a person who's harmed them, and making a decision about how they're going to relate to that person. And if you remove that person, they don't get to make that decision. So my friend Pamela Dobodobazela, I can say her name, it took me a long time to say it, was a fellow in my program my first year at Harvard, and she was just finishing her work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And her job was to interview all the people whose testimony would come from the Western Cape, which was Cape Town. It was a huge area. And she, as a social psychologist, she interviewed victims to see if their story should go forward and then prep them for testifying. And so she wrote a book called, it's not at our website because it's not about veterans at this point, but it's called A Human Being Died That Night. And it's actually about the strange relationship she developed with a man named Eugene de Kock, who was called the Adolf Eichmann of South Africa and prime evil in the press. And when she interviewed him, he was in prison for 250 consecutive life sentences because he had created the assassination training camp called Vakplas, where they trained assassins for the government. And he himself had assassinated many people. And he had admitted to 250 or so of these assassinations. And he was in prison. They are actually working to get him out of prison right now. She thought it was a pipe dream when he started talking about getting out of prison, but he may actually leave prison, but before he dies. He's pretty old. But he turned state's witness against the apartheid government. And because he had created that camp, he knew who the offenders were. And the Truth Commission's role was to get the truth. And so anybody who had committed violence on either side, the ANC and the government, if they were willing to come forward and tell the truth about what they had done, they were granted amnesty. And there were lots of people that could have hid. But Eugene de Kock named names. And his willingness as state witness to give them every name he could think of anyone he did something, had done something, and he had trained, meant they could force them to come forward because they had the choice to go to prison or to tell the Truth Commission the truth. And Pumla believed that if he hadn't done that, the Truth Commission would have failed because so many people who did terrible things would have just gotten off scot-free. So that's the context in which she interviewed him in prison. And de Kock was willing, and this happened many times, he was willing to apologize to any family of a victim he had harmed. And the families that came to him, he apologized. And pretty much they forgave him. Because she believed, and they believed, he sincerely regretted his behavior. It wasn't that he was faking it. So that was already a remarkable thing. that victims and of families of victims and a perpetrator who had done terrible things were willing even to speak to each other, much less have a relationship with which the perpetrator was forgiven. And he even apologized to Pumla indirectly by saying, "Did I hurt anyone in your family?" She's black. And she didn't think he had directly had. He said, "If I have, I apologize." So she had developed a very strange relationship to him of a kind of empathy for him, which is part of what this book is about, is how across this massive divide of violence, she was able to have a sympathetic relationship to the worst assassin in the history of South Africa. But the thing that was surprising about her book, the thing that I think is interesting about her book, is that she also observed there were plenty of perpetrators who were not sorry and did not apologize. They just told the truth, including Stephen Biko's killers, right? They were not sorry, they did not apologize. And in some cases, she observed that families who had been harmed forgave the perpetrator anyway. When they were not sorry, did not apologize, sometimes they would say, "We forgive you." So she started puzzling, what does forgive mean in that context? Because we have this system, repentance, making amends, then you could be forgiven, all that. Contrition, this is the Pope's thing on abortion, the woman has to be contrite. Right? There's a contrition. And what she concluded from observing this many times was that forgiveness really isn't about the perpetrator. It's really about what is going to be the rest of your life now that you have had this awful traumatic thing happen to you as a victim of somebody else's behavior. And what she observed is that the families who chose to forgive had really decided that this person, sorry or not, was no longer going to have the power to control their future. They were not going to live obsessed with whether the person was sorry or not, or obsessing about the harm done to them. They had accepted the harm. It was irreversible. They were going to have to live with it, but they were going to move on. And so it was a kind, she experienced it as a kind of closure for them. Not closure in the sense we usually mean it, but a kind of period on the end of that sentence. That sentence has already been spoken. It's going to have a period on the end of it. We're going to have a new sentence moving forward, even though that sentence is still there. And I think that often, when you had irreversible, really damaging trauma, that's maybe the best you can do, is just to decide, this is part of my story, it was an awful part of my story, but I'm just going to move into the future with this there, but not hovering, dominating every waking moment of my life. So I think that was something that I think was a really important insight that came out of that, for me, out of reading her book and talking to her. Yeah.
The point about the person that more or less didn't say they were sorry or anything, but for them to allocute or disclose what happened was really supportive for that family to have closure, to be able to forgive, to know what happened to their loved one.
That's right.
Which makes a big difference.
Huge. You're right. It's true. And in fact, she observed sometimes a victim in the hearing itself would ask for more details. Right? Like this man who was killed, his wife was killed by the ANC. He asked the guy what she said, what her body was doing, and she was puzzled about that. Why did he want all the gory details of it? And she realized that what he wanted to know was her last minute of life in this world. What had happened to her, as awful as it was, he wanted to hold on to it as long as he could. And so he wanted the last tiny details of how she died as a way to be close to her in her death. And it was really powerful, because I think the perpetrator wasn't particularly sorry, and it sort of didn't matter to him. He just wanted the facts.
Well, how does the paradigm of moral injury speak to the perpetrator in that sense.
There you go. That's the thing. Peter's Story, who put the Truth Commission together for Nelson Mandela, he was his chaplain on Robben Island. He was a consultant to us on our Truth Commission, and when he heard about this moral injury concept, what he said was, this is the missing piece in the Truth Commission where we didn't know what to do with the perpetrators. Okay? Yeah. So that's exactly the right question. Because they didn't forgive them, they just gave them amnesty, which is a different thing. No punishment. But that was really all that happened. So people would tell the truth about what happened and then have to go home after everybody knew they'd done these things. And they didn't have a way to integrate the perpetrators. And I think that is the problem when you polarize things along who's a worthy person for help and who's not a worthy person for help. And they wanted to take care of the victims, and they did. Even then, it was inadequate because they didn't have any money. It was kind of draconian to pay people for deaths and things. But they tried to do symbolic things, like the school teacher who'd written a song. They made it the national anthem because he'd been killed. They did things like that, or they put a plaque up where somebody had died. Things like that. So they tried to honor the victims, but basically the perpetrators were sort of sent out, as it were, into no person's land. So he said he thought this was the missing piece. And his own son almost got trapped in it because he was drafted and he wasn't a pacifist, but he didn't want to serve in the apartheid military, and he was gonna refuse orders and go to prison, and instead the government collapsed. So he was spared, but he was also had been worried about his own son. So there were lots of complicated things around that. But I do think when we polarize everything as good and evil, and then we want to punish people for doing bad things, and that somehow it doesn't resolve much, right? We know this from capital punishment. Lots of families who thought they were going to be fine after the person got killed are messed up because there's no resolution then. Right? And I think even the families that forgave perpetrators who weren't sorry, what that did for the perpetrator is, when you get trauma, both people are traumatized. Trauma is one of those things that creates intense emotional bonds. It may be hate, but that's a very intense emotional bond, right? So you have what's called trauma bonds from the victim and the perpetrator, and that's why a perpetrator, when they do nasty things, it can really hurt the victim again, because there's something about when one moves, the other moves. It's like there's this tight bond. And I think when those families forgave perpetrators, they just pulled away from that trauma bond, and the perpetrators were going to do what they were going to do, but they were going to move on. That frees the perpetrator. Now, that perpetrator may never change, but it gives them the possibility for it, right? So there's some interesting things going on about how do you deal with trauma by letting go, just letting go in some kind of way. In Buddhism, there's a whole discipline about that, of not being attached to your suffering, and it's a kind of quality of letting go also. It's just called non-attachment. How straightforward that is, right? Not feeding on your suffering, not making it define who you are. Yeah.
Our colleagues in Rwanda, where we are involved in the post-reconciliation work, have developed a visual for that, where they take a perpetrator and a victim, and they tie each of their wrists with a large, thick rope. And then they explain about how if only one of them is released from the rope, the other carries it around with them and drags that around with them. And it becomes a really strong visual in a non-written culture.
That's fabulous. It includes the body and the sensory. Yeah, right. It's not an intellectual. It's a ritual. Yeah. Yeah. And there are other things like that in other cultures, but that's a lovely one. Yeah. Yes.
Also, I was going to add to that sentiment that in Rwanda, what the president, Paul Kagame, did after the genocide, there was just an overabundance of people in prisons and they couldn't manage it, so they went back to a very old tradition called Gacaca courts, which is a locally run, village level kind of conversation between survivors and perpetrators, where the person is given the opportunity to admit to ask for forgiveness, but after that there is a process of reintegration. They do have to do a little bit of time in the community, hard work,
Make amends.
but the basis and the bottom line to Gachacha is to remember who we are and where we came from. Because before the genocide, people were very integrated, and it didn't matter tribe or...
We kind of need that here for the Civil War, actually.
Yeah.
Which
Just gave people meaning again.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I live in Texas now, and boy, the southern stuff, I mean, I have relatives in Mississippi as well, and the Civil War is alive and well.
Oh, yeah.
In the culture, including the way that the so-called black people punish the South over and over. So I think we could use some national rituals that do this sort of thing. There's a fabulous book by Richard Slotkin, who's an American historian. It's an old book, it's from the 1950s or something, called The Myth of Regeneration Through Violence. I think the title of the book is Regeneration Through Violence, but he uses the American West as a prototype of this, which is sort of the prototype of the Clint Eastwood type movie too, and it's a prototype of how we go to war, is that, you know, the good guy wears a white hat and the bad guy wears a black hat, and the good guy is a good guy because he doesn't want to use violence and he wants to avoid it, and he tries to avoid it as much as possible, and the black-hatted guy is using all this violence, terrible and terrorizing people. So eventually in the end, the white-hatted guy has to use violence, the only way to save people. And that is the Christian story, writ large. The only way God can save the world is through torture and murder. Or else we'd all have to pay that price, right? That's the atonement-based. It's not universal in Christianity. The Eastern Church doesn't really rely on that. But the Western Church, which is the base culture, I think, in the United States, still has that sense that somehow there's certain forms of violence that are good for you. If you have not read, if you're interested in these issues, there's a wonderful book by Jill Lepore, L-E-P-O-R-E. This one I'll write down. She writes the history column to the New Yorker. The Name of War. She was one of my fellows. She's an historian at Harvard University. The Name of War won the Bancroft Prize in History of the Year. It was published. She's a great writer, but this is about the King Philip's War, the war between the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims 50 years after the peace treaty got broken. It was the bloodiest war on U.S. soil. A fourth of the population was killed, and the villages burned, and half the Indian population died. You think about those in numbers today, it's a huge, huge bloody thing. Worse in many ways than the Civil War in terms of numbers and bloodiness. So her book is about that period and what led up to that war. But the thing that's startling is what she does after the war, which was a terrible war. That the Puritans, with increased manner, call what they call a reforming synod, to try to figure out why God, this is the idea of the providence of God, right? Why God had inflicted this war on them. Even though they won the war. The Puritans won that war. They wanted to figure out, because it was so devastating, why had God inflicted this war? They concluded that the reason that God had inflicted this war on them is that they had lost their piety and they had not prayed as much and read the Bible as much and done all the pious things as much as they ought to have done. And so in order to draw them close and back into his heart, God had inflicted this awful war on them to remind them of what they needed to be doing. Not how they were treating the Indians, not how other people, but that their God cared so much about them that he would do this to pull them back and to remind them. So this is the myth of regeneration through violence. God is going to save you by making a terrible thing happens so you will come back.
Wow.
Wow, okay? Gets worse. Gets worse. Within 20 years after this war, historians stopped writing about it because this woman, I know I can't remember her name, Mary something. Anyway, she wrote a captivity narrative. She had been in this war. She had all her children killed, and her infant baby was shot in her arms, and then she was taken captive for the year of the war, and she endured all this horrible hardship being a captive of war with the Indians, and her picture of the Indians is they were mean and cruel to her, that she nearly starved. Of course, what she didn't realize is they were all going through the same starvation, and I mean, it's like she just endured the conditions the Indians were enduring, the Wampanoags, during the war. But she interpreted this as being this stuff being inflicted on her, and it was true. She was deeply traumatized. She'd lost her entire family. So after the end of the war, she was returned to her Puritan community, and so at the end of this captivity narrative, she writes all about this. And at the end, she says, "And so now today, when I lie in bed, I think of gratitude because I took my past life for granted and I didn't appreciate what I had. And in losing it and returning it to me, God reminded me to be grateful for what He had done for me, and that He had inflicted this sorrow on her as a way to bring her back." It's a sad theology. And so she says, "So I used to lie comfortably in my bed and sleep through the night, and now I lay awake thinking of what He has done for me." So increased Mather encouraged. I mean, this is the first bestseller in the colonies. It was in print for 100 years, and it resulted in a whole series of captivity narratives being written that then defined the nature of that war, the name of war, and how good it is for you when God inflicts this upon you. I know. It's really sad. She clearly had PTSD. I mean, it was that she couldn't sleep at night.
It happens.
And what did they do? Tell her to be grateful for this.
That way they don't have to take responsibility.
Yeah.
What you say is certainly is defined in Old Testament theology in terms of what you're saying.
Oh, yeah.
But I have a question, because you said they formed the Reforming Synod. And that goes to my question, because you have more injury can affect medical professionals, medical. What happens, how are you defining war? I mean, how do you define war? And what happens to the issue of moral injury and forgiveness if there's no mechanism at all to address what's happened?
So I'm not defining war. I'm using the term war when it's used in relation to certain kinds of violence, but I think you could call certain cities war zones.
Okay, well that's
or right now what's happening in Ferguson. Ferguson was a war zone in some ways. Not after but before the police shooting. The problem with the way Ferguson is being framed is as if this is an increase in police violence, when in fact police used to lynch and kill black people for. I mean, this war's been going on since slavery, right? Since abolition anyway. Before that, they just, so the idea that we now have a sudden rise in police violence against black people, I think, is a myth. It's a distortion of what's happening. What's happening is now there's video tests. People actually have proof it's been happening. The black community has been saying for centuries or for decades it's been happening, but nobody believed them. You must have committed a crime, that's why the police shot. That sort of thing. And now it's like people are getting shot in the back. I mean, so now we know the truth. But that's a kind of war that's been waged on black bodies for a long time.
Okay.
Right?
That's great, yes,
But war is metaphorical at that point, right? You don't have there's a certain formal definition of war is two nations declare something, and we haven't declared war since World War II.
Okay.
Everything else is a police act, a military action.
And taking your definition of soul repair, which I like, but I like healing also. But but I don't see in your definition, which I truly agree with, for me, there is really no mechanism to develop accountability. I don't see where there's accountability, and I don't see where there's a mechanism that can create forgiveness.
You can't create forgiveness.
No, what I'm saying is, the thing is, if there is someone, if there's evidence.
Can I get through this, and then if I haven't answered your question at the end of this, you can ask it again, okay? Because this is going to take a long time. So the other thing that's important to remember about trauma is it's contagious. And if you are a caregiver or a person who works with people with trauma, you have to have a lot of self-awareness and know what your limits are, and don't get yourself down inside a hole where you go into a crisis, because you cannot save everything. And that's just the facts. You can do your best, and it's important to do your best, and you can make mistakes and have some moral injury of your own, and you need a way to process it. Don't carry it along. That's the worst thing you can do, is to just keep carrying it. So part of the way moral injury works is that you may remember who you were before and feel like you're outside of yourself in some way, looking at yourself. There's a sort of sense of split. This is a series of photographs a photographer did of veterans when they came back from Iraq. And so she had them get on in their uniform and then get in their civilian clothes and have them looking at each other. And so many vets who see this picture say, oh yeah, that's exactly how I felt. I was looking at somebody else. So, and there was a series of, the masks I've been showing come from a project that Walter Reed, that a therapist did, where when the vets, especially those with TBI, couldn't talk about their experiences, she had them make masks. To just, and then they could talk about it from looking at what they had created. And some of them had their children or their spouse help them make them out. And I think this in some way captures what moral injury feels like. It's intense feelings, it's painful. You don't want anybody to see into your soul because what's in there you don't think anybody should see, and you can't talk about it. And so one of the things I think is really important, and I think what I'm going to give you are some, the amount of grief that's behind that red and black. The amount of grief people carry who carry moral injury. There are so many losses. There's just the loss of your sense of who you were before. You know you're never going to be that person again, and that person does no longer exist. And how are you going to find your way back home if you don't know who that person is? You may lose your best friends. You may lose your faith. You may lose when you leave the military, you lose your job. And other people may not want to employ you. There's an amazing scene at the end of the TV series, The Pacific, when this young man comes back from Okinawa after having been a Marine machine gunner in the Pacific War, and he's trying to go to college, and then this young woman saying, well, what kind of skills did you learn in the military that you could do in a job here at our college? And he says, I know how to shoot guns. Well, what else did you do? Well, I loaded and I can take apart a machine gun. Well, what else did you do? And he just looks at her and he says, I'm good at killing Japs, that's what I do. And that's often how veterans feel. They come back, and so people want to know, well, what kind of job skills you have? And what they actually have a lot of skills, but they don't know how to translate that in the civilian world, and they feel useless, they've lost their job. They also come home to a different family, because the deployment is also hard on families. Their wife may be pregnant by somebody else, or their wife may have learned to do everything they used to do for her, or in the case of the woman, the father's done all the child care now. She used to think he couldn't do any of it. Now she realizes she's not needed. There are all these ways in which you come back to a family that's not the same family. So you've lost your own self. Now you lost your family. You may have lost your God, your meaning system, your sense of being a good person. And you may finally decide it's too hard to stay alive. It's just too many things you're carrying that you lost. So I think there's an enormous amount of grief under the anger and under all of those other kinds of feelings. There's just a huge load of grief. And I think that needs to be attended to ritually. There is really no good way to process grief by yourself. That's why every religious tradition has something they do for people who are in a state of grief. We just tend to focus on funerals and not on other losses, and I think it would be good to think more broadly about times in the liturgical calendar, times to spend letting people grieve. I know when the Sandy Hook shooting happened in the elementary school, it happened during Advent, and I realized, oh my gosh, there's the story of the slaying the innocents in the Epiphany story. There it is. Right? So when has the church done a ritual of grief for all the dead children? Not often. I know some churches that have a day where they read the numbers of children killed in poverty and they pay attention to it, but most churches, when they have their Christmas canon, they slide right over that slaying of the innocents real quick and get to the Magi. Right? Because it's not appropriate for children. Right? But it's there. And it might be an interesting moment to do a different kind of ritual in there. I know in the church I was at, they would do a thing called Blue Christmas for all the people who got sad at Christmas. But that was just for the people who were sad. It was not for the whole congregation. I think grief has to happen in the larger context. You don't put all the sad people and make them be by themselves. It's not the right way to do a ritual. Yes?
You outlined the induction process. Is there any impetus for the government or the military to work at programs so that everyone coming out of service has counseling or reprogramming to try to prevent the problems that arise?
Here's what I know. The military itself has a suicide problem. It's been having a rising suicide. It used to be lower than the general population. Now it's about even, so they know they have a problem within the military. But the veteran suicide rate has also gotten them worried. So they've instituted several attempts at transition programs. There's a program I think the Army does called TAPS, Transition Assistant something. It used to be a day, and that's gone to 2. And now some units do 5 days, like a whole work week. I think the way that program works is inadequate because the military does things with briefings. So what happens is they get a week of briefings. They get information on how to find a job, information on how to apply for the GI Bill for college, information on family relationships, information on PTSD, and maybe if they have it, they should get help, information on how to apply to the VA for benefit. They get maybe an hour with a chaplain. So they get briefings, but they don't get a chance to process. Yeah?
You're absolutely right. The military has usually a 1 to 2 week transition period. Military, different branches of service also have, within the Army, I'm a master resilience trainer.
Yeah.
The Army has adopted this program. It's got a huge spiritual, emotional, physical focus on it. However, the downside is, like you said, everything's a briefing. You get 1 hour every month maybe to teach a 3-hour class, and nobody even absorbs what this stuff means.
Right.
So the focus is still on our operational theaters and not on coming home.
Yeah, it's a military style, right? That's how it works.
It is.
And that's what they know how to do. I think the other problem with it is, and I learned this teaching women's studies, I'll get you in just a sec. If you start telling people as they're leaving college that they won't be able to make enough money for the lifestyle they thought they were, and here's what you have, they panic. And you can't learn anything when you're in a panicked, scared state. And I think the closer some people get to leaving the military, the more anxious they get. So it's like not a good time to be piling on a lot of information to somebody without any time for them to process their own feelings that are happening around the departure. And they may be happy to get out. That's another way they're not listening. They just sit there and say bye and then get out. And they won't have listened to anything because they're just so happy to get out. So I think it's the briefings are layered under the weaknesses of trying to help people retain information in a context when they're really not ready or don't want to hear it. Yes?
I was the Air Force chaplain for 27 years, and every new group of recruits that we got I was responsible for giving a suicide prevention briefing.
So you told them not to do certain things, right? Is that what you were asked to do, sort of, what, this, that?
No, we had a formal briefing on
A
giving
formal briefing,
statistics about why the suicide rate was increasing, and then gave them helped them identify the signs of suicide so they could watch out for their buddies, and then help them to understand what actions they could take if they were experiencing any of those areas.
Yeah, and when did you do this?
I said I was in the military for 27 years.
When
as a
did you
chaplain.
leave the military?
When did I leave the military?
Yeah.
2011.
2011, okay. I know that they've been trying to do more of that lately because they're worried.
No, I'm saying that I did those briefings from the time I was a chaplain.
Yeah, yeah. And the suicide rates were low until about 20.
They were just not reported as suicides. They have
No, yeah, well, they did that too. They hid the suicides, yeah. But so that's to say that's what the transition programs tend to look like from the military side. And I actually don't think it's a good idea to expect the military to do it because the DOD's job is to create a military force that can, as President Bush said, fight and win wars. But in October of last year, and this is a project I've been thinking about working on for the last 5 years, and a group of us at the Solar Care Center had put together a proposal for a 2-week transition program that would be more focused on body knowledge, processing, and getting people stabilized. And giving them ways to do early interventions. So we called it a prevention training, not a treatment program, but a prevention training program. We had been working on that anyway, but in October of 2014, the Joint Chiefs Office of Reintegration published a white paper that said that none of the service branches was doing an adequate job of transitioning people out of the military, and that there needed to be room for public-private partnerships to do this work because the private sector can move more nimbly and experimentally and quickly on these issues than can the federally funded projects, because there's so many bars you have to, meet in order to have federal authorization to do things. So, that's what they called for, and that was exactly what we had been designing. So. All spring, my colleague at TCU, we proposed a pilot study with psychometric research to find out what really works. With a 2-year longitudinal study with a control group that would focus the transition on the spiritual health, resiliency, moral injury issues, and fold in a bunch of other stuff like a sleep expert, physical training, nutrition, and it's all these things that an 18-year-old might not even have had the skill sets in or in the military. And so we talked to the Office of Reintegration of the Joint Chiefs, we talked to the Chief of Chaplains, several people there, and the Pentagon. We talked to a number of congressional staffers for the majority party in the House that work on Veterans Affairs. And what was interesting was this is why I said talking to generals of the Pentagon, a strange thing to be doing as a feminist theologian, but that's what I was doing. And what we discovered is no one on the Hill in Congress had heard the term moral injury. They know what it was. As soon as we explained it, what we were trying to do, they all went, oh, wow, that makes sense. So nobody said to us, well, that's a dumb idea, or, oh, it can never happen, or, give up. Nobody said that. They tried to help us figure out where the obstacles would be and what would happen if we did this or that. And then we talked also to DECO, the Defense Center on Excellence, and they also gave us some excellent feedback. And the Office of Reintegration was really excited that somebody had actually picked up the challenge in the white paper. The Army Chief of Chaplain's Office sent us to places we might even find some possible funding for. So we have that plan. After talking to DECO in the middle of the summer, we realized that what we were doing was so large, we wanted to use 400 people for the sample so we'd get a good result. What we were trying to do was so huge that it was outside the normal parameters of controlled studies that most people are used to looking at and evaluating. So we took a step back and said, okay, and we were going to have to get a base commander to agree to turn 200 people loose for 2 weeks at the end of their time in the military to come do the transition program. And we were talking to people at Fort Hood, but we realized that was a very big hurdle with a manpower shortage in the military already. So we stepped back and we pulled back from it. So now the plan is to do 100 veterans who have been released within the last year who are on the GI Bill to go to college. So we will be able to have a control population that we can observe. We will be able to have a control group and a participant group and to continue to do the psychometric studies. So right now we're looking, and the cost of it went from $6 million to $1 million. So we're looking at a cost of about $1 million to do a 2-year pilot for 100 college students with 1 week of the intensive boot camp-like training body process. And then instead of 2 weeks, a 1 week like orientation to college prevention training program, and then a 1 month tune-up for that rest of that academic year that they would come back for 1 day a month for a tune-up. And then a control group who didn't get any of it but would take the same psychometric survey. So we think we've still got a good design for the project. So now we're in the process of finding a foundation or someplace that will hand over $1 million to us. Yes?
Forgive me if this is coming up ahead, but you had mentioned earlier, and it really struck me, that many vets come back with impaired ability to learn when they're on a GI Bill at school. There's not a lot we, as educators, can do to even, our traditional ways of dealing with learning disabilities don't accommodate this.
No, they don't.
Is this part of, since these are going to be college students,
That's part of it,
training?
is we're going to measure their ability to complete a first year. There is a problem with retention in vets in college, and certainly they can't learn if they have PTSD and other things. So, yeah, that's part of the strategy, is that we think they'll do better not only in life but in college, because the point is, I looked in planning this project, I studied a lot of retreat programs and things that are done for vets that are really great at what they do. So like there's a group in Angel Fire that does a week of enrichment with a spouse and a vet, and it really stabilizes marriages, is really helpful. There are these like 4-day weekend retreat things where people get to talk about their story and cathartic do stuff. But one of the things that we thought were a major weakness in most of those projects is that they don't do follow-up. And they have no metrics. So they may be quite effective, but they have no proof that what they do is better than doing nothing. So, and I think that that's a major weakness. If you can't tell, all you get are the anecdotal stories from the people who succeeded, you're going to self-reinforce and think it's working. When in fact, it may not be working all that well. And for the people it didn't work for, you're not going to hear from them. In fact, sometimes, and I think part of the weakness of some of those programs is that they focus on this catharsis that finally they can tell their story, or they can release what happened to them, which is not a bad thing. But they don't have a strategy for how to stabilize them. This is what we used to do in camp. How are they going to go down the hill and survive? It's like, how are they going to leave this mountaintop experience, this great thing that happened to them, and go home to their ordinary gray life and survive that, right? So it's like, as I used to tell people, it's like church camp. You go up, you have this amazing experience at church camp. You have the same old parents to go home to. Right? So the focus of our program is not so much those cathartic, euphoric experiences. And I know this from teaching Buddhist studies, that the most dangerous moment in the practice of meditation is that a cathartic release from all your negative emotions, because you confuse that with enlightenment, and enlightenment is not euphoria, it's calmness.
Yes.
It's stabilizing. So what we're trying to do in this program is get people calmed down. So 3 hours a day of spiritual calming practice, morning, noon, and night, 1 hour each. A sleep expert, sleep hygiene, how to fall asleep without drinking. Some physical fitness stuff to stay physically healthy, some helpful stuff on nutrition. We may even have a cooking class. Some information about symptoms of both PTSD and moral injury, and where in the community there are people. We'll bring professional service providers up to the experience, keep it local, so they actually know somebody they can talk to about PTSD if they have to go home and talk about it to somebody. So we want to hook them up with people from their communities so that the community they go back to doesn't look the same either to them. Not a bunch of gray strangers, but people they have talked to. And we're going to have them organized into squads of 5 each with a peer veteran leader. So when they go down the hill, they have 4 other people and a peer leader they can call if they feel like they're getting into trouble. Teach them early intervention, teach them how to get help before they go down into the crisis. So the whole focus of the transition is stabilization and connection to their community, so they're not alone. And we'll have time for them to process, to talk to each other and other things. We'll have some art therapy, some other ways that people can express trauma that don't necessarily require words. Anyway, that I think is a better transition program than a briefing, right? Even a long briefing. Because the problem is that they come out of the military, especially if they've been deployed, with a lot of adrenaline, and they're ambitious to get to work, and they have this sort of drive at first, this energy from the stress hormones that they've been carrying, and it's really when they run out of that charge that they often go down into a deep hole. And we're trying to prevent that drop, that crisis from afflicting them by giving them early intervention help. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what are some of the methods you're going to use to collect your psychometrics?
I can send you the proposal. That's not my area of specialization, but the person that designed it, there are 2 people that designed it. One is the statistical analyst for TCU, and the other is the person who was head of the psych department for 15 years and is now the graduate associate dean for research and graduate studies at TCU, and he's an expert on psychometric research. He used to work at NIH. So the 2 of them have designed, the decode folks who do that kind of thing were really impressed with the psychometric plan. It has, life satisfaction things. They're using a provisional grid from Bill Nash on moral injury. They're using a whole bunch of things that we're going to pay everybody $50 every time they take the survey, so they'll take, college students, $50 a pop is a really cool thing, right? But I can send you the design if you'd like to see it. Yeah.
So is your sample self-selection, or will they be selected randomly?
They will be recruited. So you can't force, this is the same way you do a drug trial. You ask for people who want to participate. But we have participation from UT Arlington, which has a very large veteran population. TCU has about 300, so we have a good group to draw from at TCU. Tarrant County Community College has a big veteran. So all of these colleges are part of an organization that are participating in this study.
But given that, then, are you going to select the control group matched?
That'll be random. Yeah, that'll be, yes. We're not going to, it's going to be a scrambled 100. And there's going to be 50 that take the pilot and 50 that don't. But I'm not the metric researcher on this, so I can't give you the details.
Well, I just wondered,
it's not my area.
But I just wondered in terms of control group ethics, will the control group be offered that program?
Yes, the control group will receive it at the end of the year.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. The people at TZ know what they're doing with this. I just trust them because they've done so many of these studies. Yeah, no, they're good. They've done a lot of these kind of studies. I have not, so I'm not going to tell them what to do. But the decode people who do review these grant proposals for the federal government were really impressed with our study process.
I'm just curious about the ability to generalize. That's why I asked the question in terms of this.
And let's get off the psychometric thing, because it would be better if you talked to the people who designed it than to me. What I know is the design of the week-long process. And we'll try to see what worked and what didn't. This is another one of those masks. People who have moral injury may look like the left side of the mask, but the inside will look like the right side of the mask. And it's an incredible load to carry. So I'm going to go, but these are sort of obvious, I think, if you think about them, and I'm going to walk you through some of the ways that recovery happens. One is a trusted group of friends, not therapists, not people who are going to take care of you, but people who are willing to be your friend and walk with you on this long road to recovery. And it will be a different, if you're a church doing ministry, you really need to have a group. This is not a fair thing to ask families to do. It's not a fair thing to ask one person to do. You cannot rebuild a moral identity without being in a community that actually thinks your life matters to them. And that's what a group of friends is for. And communities provide that, which means that it's a group of mutual vulnerability, not of one person sharing all their sorrows and everybody listening and taking care of them.
Great image.
Isn't that good? It's from some group in England that had a demonstration.
It looks like England.
It does look like England. And sometimes the vulnerability isn't the same kind of vulnerability. So, for example, if you're not a combat veteran, you may not have had any of those experiences and not really even been able to relate to them exactly. But I have found that if you are a safe person or a person they trust to talk to, that just opening your heart and hearing how they're taking their feeling and what they're struggling with into your own heart is a way to make yourself vulnerable, and it's a way that their burden gets shared, and it's deeply appreciated, that quality of listening, non-anxious presence, open heart, non-judgmental. And that when they ask moral questions, instead of giving answers, you struggle with them through that process. So one of our vets that's a peer leader in Fort Worth, who actually, the CBS Religion and Culture people did a documentary with us that aired in some places Sunday and will air this coming Sunday, but is available online to see. And this veteran is interviewed. I'm interviewed, and this veteran that we work with is interviewed in that documentary. And he thought, he was an Army Ranger Special Ops in Vietnam. He killed a lot of people. But the thing that haunted him was a moment when they had shot up the village, and there was a baby lying on the ground. The village was pretty much dead, but they found a baby lying on the ground that had a wound, a thing in its chest, but it was still alive. And so Michael wanted to save it, and he picked up this baby, and he wanted to carry it to the medic, and he thought he should pull that spike out of its heart, and it bled out in his arm.
Yeah.
So he thought he had killed that baby. And when he got home, he couldn't touch his own baby children because he thought he would hurt them. He believed he was a baby killer. Now, he had a lot of PTSD, and he still carries shrapnel in his body, so a lot of his thinking was scrambled, but that's what he believed. And I think intellectually, he knew that probably that baby would have died anyway, as wounded as it was, but he still felt like he was a baby killer. And he struggled with that. He finally got off of heroin in 2005. He was addicted to heroin from Vietnam to 2005. He tried a couple of times, couldn't get off. So, I was telling his story, okay? I was with a group of military chaplains. I do seminars with military chaplains. I was telling his story, and this woman came up to me afterwards, and she said, has Michael ever thought that that baby probably would have died anyway? And his picking it up like that gave it a a chance to die in loving arms instead of on the cold ground, or bouncing in the back of the medic truck. That he actually, that baby knew it was cared about when it died. That it felt these warm arms. And I thought, I am positive Michael's never thought about it like that. So I thought, this is not an intellectual argument she's giving him. She is giving him a different way to feel about what he did, right? So I sent him an email because I wasn't going to see him for a while. He was in San Antonio doing some kind of training. So I typed this note to him and I said, this chaplain asked me this question, Michael, have you ever thought about it this way? So I get this reply and says, this is such a word of grace to this miserable old sinner. And I thought that's a kind of hearing that she was doing. She wasn't trying to argue with him or give him an intellectual solution to something, but she felt something in what he did, and she wanted him to know that maybe that was another way to feel about it, is that he was the one note of mercy and grace that baby felt before he died. That's a kind of listening that's a really powerful kind of listening. She didn't tell him what to think. She didn't propose an answer to his problem. She just said, it's like this. That's how it feels to me, that what you did, it feels like this. So, as I said before, the lamentation piece is really important, and to help people feel the grief that they're carrying. And then the rituals are important because they take place in liminal space. They don't take place in historical and ordinary time. And so they have this sort of almost magical quality of things happening that don't happen in ordinary space and time. And they are like a container for things that are too hard to do in ordinary life. They provide that kind of container. So grieving rituals, this one is a picture of the Navajo Enemy Way ceremony that they do for their returning soldiers, which is, if you want a description, it's a little bit of a description of it. It's in the memoir Code Talker by a man named Chester Nez, who was one of the original Navajo code talkers in World War II. And he came home after 6 months. He wanted to kill himself, so his family did a 9-day enemy way, and the ghost went away. But he says it's secret, so he couldn't tell you too much, but he does describe it, sort of what happened and the theology of it, how it works. Herm Kaiser told me this story about his church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. When they have somebody leaving the military, they actually have the person come into the congregation in their uniform, and they give his military record and how he or she served, and then thank them for being willing to serve their country on their behalf. And then the person leaves and takes off the uniform and puts on civilian clothes and comes back into the congregation, and they all come up and lay on hands and welcome that person back into their congregation as one of their members. And he said, people weep, it's so powerful. Just a simple change of clothing, a change of sense of who they are, and the congregation embracing them in their return. It's a welcome home kind of moment. That's another kind of ritual that can be done. Art is a really powerful processor of moral injury because it engages all the faculties. It engages the perceiving brain, the emotional brain, and the thinking brain all at one time, and the body in a concrete activity. So Bessel van der Kolk, the guy who's an expert on trauma, he has actually talked about how dance and theater and other forms of art help people process their trauma. Just acting out in a completely imaginary way, but feeling angry feelings can help people process anger or sorrow or all kinds of things. Theater of War is a group out of New York that actually performs some of the Greek plays like Ajax because they have now concluded that a lot of those Greek plays that involve war and conflict were written by veterans because Sophocles was a general in the Greek army. So they even suggest that these plays were actually written for veterans to process what they had experienced. It's a really interesting way to think about the Greek tragedy, isn't it? Well, Jonathan Shea was the first person to read Homer through the eyes of veterans. He won a MacArthur Genius Award not for being a VA clinician, but for writing a book about Homer that nobody had ever written before. Right? It's really interesting. So there's drama, there's visual arts, singing. Singing is another way that helps you process. It's also doing the arts, like visual arts and singing and things, really help your body system. They really help your body system stay healthy. Michael Yando, who is a student at Bright Divinity School, was an EOD, it's an ordnance disposal specialist in Iraq, had a serious case of moral injury, became a music major in college. Really helped, music I think really helped him. And then we all in our religious traditions have spiritually calming disciplines. And it really does change your brain waves if you can learn to calm yourself down through meditation, through yoga, through prayer, through some kind of contemplative, nonverbal process. Now, Christian prayer tends to be mostly sermons with your head bowed. That's not what I mean by prayer. It's more like what Thomas Merton or somebody else would call contemplative prayer. It's a whole body exercise. And this is really interesting. Amy Cuddy in a TED Talk talks about how your body posture actually changes your emotional mood. It's not just the other way around. It's not that you move your body to how you feel. It's how your body disposition can help your feelings. So what I noticed is the traditional Christian posture of prayer induces stress and is a fear posture. Think about that. For somebody who has PTSD, they don't need that. Right? But it's a fear posture is where you close your body down and try to make it as small as possible. Right? So what do we do when we pray? That's a fear posture. That posture makes your adrenaline and cortisol levels go up. It just does. Whereas Wonder Woman pose, standing like this, give you confidence and make you feel good. Your testosterone levels, even in women, go up. That's the confidence hormone. So it's interesting when you look at, for example, yoga, which uses your body in all kinds of ways. It's interesting. Or even in sitting meditation practices in Buddhism, your body is centered, calm, and not closed down, but not huge. It's your arms are resting in your lap. So it's a comfortable, soft pose. So that's interesting to think about when you're talking about how you help people calm down, is what you're asking their bodies to do as well. We usually don't think about it. You think about your mind is going to calm you down, but actually your body is part of it. And eventually, people actually have to be able to talk about what happened to them at some point through the art, through the music, through the dance, through the calming practices. At some point, giving it language is an important part of the process of recovery. Because eventually, when you can tell your story many times, you begin to get control of it and it stops controlling you. And that's when you know you're okay. Not that you're good, but that you're okay, that you are now able to keep processing. Because this is what we know about memory. Memory changes all the time because it's affected by what our circumstances at the moment we remember things. A memory parasite never changes. So you know you're getting better when your memory starts changing the story. It's sort of the opposite way you think, but memory is an act of imagination in a lot of ways. So you know, like when I talk about my father coming home from Vietnam now, my whole sense of who he was is very different now that I know all this stuff about moral injury. I tell that story of our experience very differently than I used to tell it. So I'm processing my own sense of regret for not knowing what was wrong with him, not being more patient, more understanding about what I thought was how terrible he was being to me. So that's how you know you're processing things, is your memory and the way you tell yourself a story keeps changing. Yes?
I stayed away from the Vietnam veterans until about 5 years ago. I was invited to join when somebody saw a cap that said Vietnam era veteran. And I'm a history teacher in high school, and I thought it would be a good idea to record. There were 28 that didn't survive from Cuyahoga County, but there were a dozen or so that come to the meetings. And I thought it would be good to get their record on paper for the future for students. But the president said to me he didn't even want to think about it. So.
Well, there is an issue if it's in educational context about research on human subjects and IRBs and ethical codes of conduct and stuff that you do have to kind of do if you're going to do something like that. And a lot of institutions don't have the infrastructure for that. Bright Divinity School is working through TCU because Bright doesn't have any structure for receiving federal grants and no IRB would go through TCU. So that may be that reason for that response. I think you have to understand the context also of the administrator and what they're having to manage and think about, like not getting sued. It's a really important thing. So one other factor in this process is the veterans, first of all, are trained in the military to think of it being important that their lives serve other people. So they're used to wanting to serve others. And that's part of the recovery process. And this is Team Rubicon, which is that Marine unit that was in the New York Times with the high suicide rates. They founded Team Rubicon to do disaster relief. So Clay Hunt was one of the founders of Team Rubicon. And they did it because they know how to survive in a disaster area, but this is a way to put their skills to saving lives. And it matters a lot to vets to do that. So my friend Camilo, he worked as a community organizer for a while. He says that you have to do good work in the world to balance the good for all the harm you've done. And for him, this process of making amends by being of service to the larger society is a really important impulse. That's part of his life trajectory moving forward. This is how he uses what happened to him. And that's another thing that religious communities just automatically tend to have as ways to be of service to others. It's a really important gift of religious communities. So I'm almost done. So this is just a sort of look at some of the other professions that have, when I've talked, I've had lawyers come up to me and say, you know, lawyers have a very high suicide rate. Have you thought about moral injury and veteran movement and lawyers? And then he told me his own moral injury story, that he won a case as a corporate attorney. He didn't think he should have won. He hated winning that case. It haunts him. The BART up in the lower upper right, that is the shooting of Oscar Grant by the BART police. The man who shot him is one of the few police officers ever to go to prison. He was convicted and of manslaughter and he spent 8 months in prison. You can tell from the video he was shocked that he shot him. He just jumps back and says, oh my God, oh my God. But we have a litigious society, so I'm sure he's never been able to apologize if he even wanted to. And then the lower left is Sandy Hook. And what it must have been like for an EMT to walk in and see all of those dead children they couldn't save. Just must have been devastating. And then the last one at the lower right is just the doctor. And again, we live in a litigious society, and some states have what they call a 24-hour rule, where a medical caregiver can apologize to the family of a patient or to a patient within 24 hours of having done something they think is something they should apologize for, and it can't be held against them in any kind of legal action. What they found, and this I think is just sort of human, if you think about it, it's sort of a human thing, is when a doctor apologizes, people are less likely to sue just because they often sue to get the truth. But medical, there was an article a couple of years ago on moral distress in nurses, because nurses are told to lie to patients and do treatments they disagree with, and they have to just deal with it. So they have a lot of their own moral distress from harming people that they didn't want to harm. So here are some of the key pieces I've talked about: processing a story, feeling heard, deeply heard, by what the VA clinicians call a benevolent moral authority. I would call chaplain or clergy, maybe a religious person from a church. Having their unseen needs acknowledged, understanding that they're carrying pain that can't be seen, that accepting and processing memory and feelings. They have to get comfortable processing their own internal anguish, retelling a story to gain control of their memory and thought processes, rituals for transformation, rebuilding relationships. This is the reclaiming of soul, is to restore empathy and connection to others in a deep way, and gaining a moral identity through contributions to others. So rebuilding a moral identity coming out of serious trauma takes a lifetime. And you can feel okay one minute, and then you can have something happen to you, lose your job, lose somebody important to you, make a huge error or something, and go all the way back to the beginning and start over. That's just how it goes. Life is like that. Nothing is very linear about this product. Nothing internal in human beings is linear anyway. But it's and so this is just an advertisement for the conference we're doing in Kansas City at the end of October. Just about everybody I've mentioned to you in this talk is speaking. Tyler Boudreau, Camilo Mejia, Jancy Bridges are all on a panel of veterans testifying to their moral injury experience and how they recovered. Bill Gibson is doing a PTSD workshop. We have an entire plenary on how oppression impacts moral injuries. So Dale Anderson from Vanderbilt Divinity School is talking about racism, and Sharita Hussain is talking about Islamophobia and how that impacts their communities of moral injury. We have Larry Graham from ILIF talking about the importance of public lamentation in society and what that does when we publicly lament. And I'm doing my 1 hour Mormon talk. And then we have a whole series of workshops. And if you want to do a deep dive into one area, we have 5 10-hour seminars. One on cultural differences in the VA clinician who's Lakota and Methodist, talking about cultural differences in processing trauma. We have one on life writing for recovery, about the writing process, taught by a senior professor of English at William & Mary, who's an expert on narrative medicine. Those are just two. I mean, you could go to the website, soulrepair.org, and all of this is listed there. This is a 3-year piece of work and processes everything we now learned the last 3 years, pretty much with the think tank we had and the senior think tank in pastoral theology. A lot of them are presenting at this event. And we probably won't do another one for 3 or 4 more years. It was so much work. But it's sort of where people who have been working on moral injury, who take religion seriously, where we are with it at this point and what we know about it. And we have everybody from military chaplains to VA clinicians to clergy to seminary students, all kinds of people who register from all over the country. So if you can come. Sorry.